Welcome to the session, Taylor Principle in Macroeconomics. Pleasure to participate in the celebration for John Taylor. He has been my mentor for almost 50 years, and I'm sorry. If you'd like to learn more about how John became my dissertation advisor, I have a talk on the television, which you're welcome to watch. So the topic of the session is the Taylor rule in macroeconomics. That is a Stanford story. What I'm going to do for a few minutes, go back. Okay, that's, this thing. Sorry, that is a Stanford story. I gave away the punchline. What I'm going to start with by taking a few minutes to talk about the prequel, which I will call Macroeconomics in the Taylor rule. That is a Columbia story. So in the mid-1970s, the dominant macroeconomic model was the new classical model with rational expectations and flexible prices. An important implication of this model, this was talked about before, was the Sargent and Wallace policy and effectiveness theorem, where systematic monetary policy had no real effects. Economists, again, was discussed before, quickly developed models with both policy effectiveness and rational expectations by incorporating either imperfect information or price and wage contracts. Problem with these initial models was that the policy effectiveness only lasted for either the amount of time for the information to be revealed or for the contracts to expire. John Taylor's staggered contract model, which was the subject of the previous session, showed that contracts as short as 2 periods could account for business cycles, provided that the contracts were not renegotiated at the same time. And his 1979 American Economic Review Papers and Proceedings article, Staggered Wage Setting in a Macro Model, elegantly demonstrated this by using math no more advanced than the quadratic formula. This is the model that Columbia PhD students in the late 1970s called the new Keynesian model, and John Cochrane calls the old Keynesian model. Problem with this approach is that these models were either extremely complicated or impossible to solve when the number of periods was greater than 2. Guillermo Calvo, in typical fashion, made the model simpler by making it more complicated, by replacing a low-order discrete time model with an infinite-order continuous time model. The key, of course, was the memoryless stochastic process for the timing of price adjustment, better known today as the Calvo theory. Combined with the forward-looking IS curve and Taylor rule, this became the new Keynesian model. John and Guillermo had different objectives. John was interested in developing models that could empirically account for US business cycles and was not really concerned with either optimality or simplicity. At one point, making the statement that eventually theorists will figure out how you can develop optimal models that account for what happens in the world, rather than wanting people in the world to change what they do to be conform with their optimal models. Guillermo was concerned with both optimality and simplicity, but was not concerned with realism. Together, they created a model which, with the addition of the Taylor rule, continues to be relevant today. We have 4 distinguished speakers here, which I will, in alphabetical order. This first speaker is Rich Clarida.
Thank you, and it's a real honor to be here for this event, and I was really pleased to be included on the program. Let me advance the slide here. Let's see, which way do I point it? Yeah, I'm pressing green. Okay. Let me give my remarks, and then maybe the slide will pop up. Okay. So I've entitled this talk, "The Taylor Rule is Almost Everywhere in Monetary Economics, but there is still room to increase market share." The two most consequential, wonderful. Okay. The two most consequential papers in monetary economics written over the past 75 years are Friedman 68 and Taylor 93. Friedman 68 introduced the concept of a natural rate of unemployment, and with it the associated construct of a vertical long-run Phillips curve. It also contains an insightful discussion of Wicksel's natural rate of interest. But whereas U star and R star, as they're known today, provide reference points in Friedman's framework for how an economy evolves to equilibrium, they play absolutely no role in the famous K% monetary policy rule that he advocates. In Friedman's framework, U star and R star are economic destinations, but not policy rule inputs. Of course, for this crowd, I don't need to elaborate that the history of K% rules is that they were rarely tried, and when they were tried in the 70s and 80s, they were found to work much better in theory and practice. By the early 1990s, thanks to Paul Volcker, who at times claimed to be pursuing a K% rule, but I think the record will show did not, the back of inflation had been broken, and thanks to Alan Greenspan, the conditions for price stability had been achieved. The time was right for something or someone to fill that vacuum in central bank practice, left by the realization that targeting monetary aggregate growth was not in reality a workable monetary policy framework. Next slide, please, if we can advance. Perfect. Oh, next slide. Great. That vacuum, of course, was filled by the other most consequential monetary economics paper written in the last 75 years, Taylor, 1993. A crucial insight of discussion versus policy rules in practice was that whereas a central bank could pick the K in a K% rule on its own, without any reference to the underlying parameters of the real economy, such as U star or R star, a well-designed interest rate rule needed to respect several requirements. First, the rule should anchor the nominal policy rate at a level equal to the sum of its estimate of the neutral real rate and the inflation target, and I'm sure John Cochrane later will talk crucially about what it means to anchor in this world. Secondly, the central bank, and this is the crucial Taylor principle, the central bank should raise the nominal interest rate more than 1-for-1 with any increase in inflation relative to the inflation target. And thirdly, central banks could, if they wanted to, lean against the wind when activity deviated from its estimate of potential. And this third requirement not only contribute to the objective of price stability, John argued, but it's obviously also desirable for central banks like the Fed that have a dual mandate. Next slide, please. Perfect. So the title of these remarks is that the Taylor Rule is almost everywhere in monetary economics, and it really is. That's not an exaggeration. The Taylor Rule is ubiquitous in both Woodford's monetary and Cochrane's fiscal theories of the price level. It provides a parsimonious and rigorous empirical account of how good monetary policy is conducted by real-world central banks, at least when they're not constrained by the ZLB. And importantly, persistent deviations from the Taylor Rule are a useful signal that perhaps central banks are not pursuing an ideal policy. The Taylor Rule is actually optimal policy in a number of workhorse new Keynesian models under extreme or simplifying assumptions, but it has that property. But what's even more impressive is that it's actually remarkably robust. And I know that was probably John's goal in the original paper, but it's actually turned out to be true over the past 30 years. Taylor rules have been inserted in almost every imaginable monetary economy, and they almost always deliver good and sometimes nearly optimal policy outcomes across a wide range of macroeconomic specifications. And Larry Christiano's work has highlighted this, and including in models of monetary policy making and exchange rate in the open economy, which certainly I've worked on over time. And as I'm sure Monika will highlight, Taylor rules feature prominently in empirical macro finance models of yield curve and bond pricing. Finally, Taylor rule or Taylor type rules are everywhere in the briefing books that staff prepare to present economic forecasts and discuss policy options with policy makers. Next slide. One place in which policy rules are at present absent in public communication by many central banks, including the Fed, about the future path of the policy rate under either a baseline outlook or perhaps a scenario. But research by Papell and Prodden suggests a straightforward way that policy rules could be added to the existing summary of economic projections. So this shows you how this approach would have worked in the March 2023 SEP, and it uses an inertial policy rule as those are favored in practice by policymakers. You know, typically the funds rate doesn't go from 0 to 9% in one meeting, so it builds in some inertia. It's important to note how the policy paths are constructed in the Papell and Prodden exercise. So in this chart to the left of the vertical line, at each calendar date before the March 2023 meeting, the policy rule path that you see are computed using the actual data available to the Fed at the dates indicated. And for dates following the vertical line, the projections use the median SEP projections for inflation and unemployment to give a Taylor rule consistent set of projections. And importantly, just to tie it to Milton, the U star and R star, which are inputs to the Taylor rule, are set equal to their median longer run values in the SEP. A similar exercise could, and I think perhaps over time may or should be presented in perhaps a revamped SEP that would include alternative scenarios to the SEP baselines. There's a lot of talk these days about central banks conveying communication less through forward guidance and more through scenario presentations. For example, the SEP could include projections conditional on slower productivity or labor force growth than assumed in the baseline, or look at a scenario in which both the inputs to the policy rule, U star and R star, are higher than the committee's consensus. So there's much more I can say, but I'm running out of time, so let me conclude by wishing the Taylor rule a very happy 32nd birthday and another 75 years of influence. Thank you.
Next speaker is Monika Piazzesi.
Thank you very much for having me on this panel. I learned about the Taylor rule from John in graduate school. For me, this was a shock because I had learned about money growth rates as an undergrad, and those made little sense to me when I learned from John that this is how central banks act. I thought this made perfect sense and had a huge influence on me. And then he invited me along, not long after, to a conference in 1998 in Florida, Isla Morada. The conference happened in the Chica Lodge, which, if you have been to the Chica Lodge, is a luxurious resort. And I, as a grad student, thought I'm in paradise. And I thought, I'm not going to tell anybody about this conference because this is obviously where the cool people are. You have to do monetary economics, otherwise you're not going to get to the Chica Lodge. That's the first time I met Larry, and many who are in the room here, I met, you don't remember, but I remember very well that I saw you at the Chica Lodge. So where is the Taylor rule important? the new Keynesian model is a leading business cycle model to think about monetary policy. The Taylor rule is one of only 3 equations in that model, so it's obviously very important. It describes how the Fed behaves based on its dual mandate, and it makes perfect sense. When you look at it, it seems like this is how you should be thinking about central banking. And then it's very useful because persistent deviations from the Taylor rule signal that maybe something is not going the right way. And so, for example, 2021, 22, that's a famous example where you had a large deviation from the Taylor rule, and probably the Fed should have had done something earlier to fight inflation. I'm also going to spend time today talking about the Taylor rule in finance. It's widely used by asset managers today, especially in fixed income markets. Fixed income strategies are essentially bets on future interest rates. When you're a successful fixed income manager, you rely on risk premia. So you count on the fact that expected returns on long bonds over the short rates are positive, and they vary over time, so you have to time the strategy. So these are time-varying deviations from the expectations hypothesis. And to think about premia, you need to think about a decomposition between expected future short rates and the rest is then the risk premium. And so let me show you how this is useful to think about future short rates, including after being a long time at the zero lower bound. Now interest rates are away from the zero lower bound. And so it's interesting for asset managers, for example, PIMCO, which is a very large, probably the largest fixed income asset manager. They publish the cyclical outlook in January of this year. And in their publication, you can see plots of the US policy rate, so the Fed funds rate, together with the Taylor rule, and they do this for various countries, the Euro area, Canada, and the UK. And for all 4 of these plots, you sort of see that policymakers were slow to catch up with the Taylor rule, and they were sort of asleep at the wheel a little bit, and then caught up later. And so that's useful for PIMCO because they say monetary policy today, it leaves room for additional cuts. So they compare essentially what the policy rate is that they have and compare that to what the Taylor rule would say they should be. You may be wondering, what is it that PIMCO is showing you? And in their fine print, they explain you the equation of the Taylor rule, interestingly, in that publication. They talk about the coefficients A and B that they're using in front of inflation and the output gap. They try out various of these coefficients, and then they plot the median. And so that's what they're showing you. Here is a blog post by Torsten Slock, who's going to be at the conference tomorrow, chief economist at Apollo. Last year, so a year ago, he had this plot of the Fed funds rate together with the Taylor rule. And then he concluded the Taylor rule at the end of this series because the Taylor rule estimate was below the Fed funds rate. He said the Taylor rule suggests the Fed should be cutting rates in March. So it's a way of forecasting. So all these examples that asset managers, how they use the Taylor rule, essentially assuming that deviations from the Taylor rule are temporary. And so that makes sense if you think of the Fed using a Taylor rule and also smoothing interest rates. So the interest rate today has some dependence on the interest rate last period, plus, and then a term that contains the Taylor rule. If that's what the Fed is doing, then you can rewrite this as deviations from the Taylor rule, and then you can see those deviations are going to die out. And so it's useful to have it as a way of thinking about where the short rate is going to go. So this way of thinking is perfectly consistent with autocorrelated deviations that should be temporary. And if it's not temporary, again, you go back of thinking of whether this might be a policy mistake or something that we should at least be talking about. And then it's also useful to predict if you look at the left-hand side, you might be thinking, can I use this to predict short rates over the long horizon? And the answer is yes. And so that's exactly what asset managers do, is they look at the deviations of the Fed funds rate from the Taylor rule today to forecast short rates even over long periods. And then you can think about risk premia. Thanks.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Larry Christiano, and I'll point out that while Stanford people greatly outnumber Columbia people at the celebration, that Larry was a classmate of mine at Columbia, so he gets a special place here.
Okay. And the clicker is what? Not this, right? Or it is? It's not clicking. Oh, I see, okay. All right, well, I'm very honored to be invited to talk here. Actually, it's better to say I'm grateful to be here. I have a lot to be thankful for from John, and however, my thankfulness and also what I learned from his papers are going to be presented in two different places. The thankfulness is in the video. It's interesting how at the beginning of this session the word kindness comes out a lot. Well, kindness and then another word, kind of tough. And I think Andy emphasized this, and maybe you looked at my video. I was struck. The word kindness shows up in my video a lot, so I'm very grateful for these things, and I have more to say about that. But right now, I'm going to talk about the John's Taylor rule, and give some thoughts about it. So some backgrounds. John played a major role in what was this success of this big revolution. I don't think that revolution is not over yet. Actually, it's going beyond rational expectations now. But this was a major revolution, and it's possible it couldn't have been successful without the role. I'll hint at this in a second. Without John's kind of input. One of the things that happened was you get an immense collaboration between academic economists and policymakers, in particular policymakers in central banks. And it was mentioned earlier that the rational expectations revolution begins with the real business cycle model, which says central banks are like meaningless. And so central bankers were not particularly keen in this, or did not find this a very interesting model. And so what John did was, and a few other giants, John and three more, Stan Fisher and Guillermo Calvo and maybe and then Julio Rottenberg, I think. John was a giant at the beginning who talked about how, who introduced sticky prices and wages, and talked about how, in this case, things like monetary policy do matter, which anybody who has any experience with the real world, of course, knows that. And that opened up this possibility for a huge collaboration between policymakers and central banks, which continues today. I actually travel around to, my latest interest is in emerging market economy. I travel around, and wherever I go, the first thing I see is a Taylor rule. And so there's a baseline model everywhere, and then all the other trappings of rational expectations too. But I think the reason why all of this has been accepted by these institutions is that because of people like John. This is a monumental thing. It may be that this whole enterprise wouldn't have succeeded without John and at least three other people that I just mentioned. Now, to build a model, you need a succinct characterization of everything, but including monetary policy. And I think most policymakers always thought of every different episode as sort of its own special type and its own special thing, and that there was no real way to describe the whole thing as part of one picture. And I think what the insight of John and the insight of the Taylor rule is that all these people who used to think that everything was a disconnected thing see, oh yeah, there's a pattern here. I'm worried about output, and I'm worried about inflation, and I can be worried about those things for a million different reasons. But that's the core of the discussions I'm having always when I'm making policy decisions. So that was the genius of this rule, which now we take for granted. It's hard to see, at this moment. And John argued not only everybody said, yeah. They said, yeah, that's what we actually do when they saw the rule. But John went one step further, so it's important as a positive thing, but also on normative grounds. And now it's the baseline all over the place. There's a simple, Monika put up something like this. There's a simple representation of John's rule, where pi is inflation and x is the output gap. And there's zillions of variants, and it's a hugely interesting discussion. Exactly how should you measure the inflation? Is it over a year, or this or that? Is it PCE? Should it be expected inflation? We can sort of have that, but this is the basic. This is the basic thing. But the core thing is not just the Taylor rule that matters. It's the Taylor principle. John has so many things named after him. Somebody asked me, is he the guy who did the Taylor series expansion? I said, yeah, he is. They were impressed. There's the Taylor principle is very, very important here. It's not just that little rule. So that rule, everybody recognizes it. But John went a step further and said, look, you should follow that rule, but you should have the coefficient on inflation be, well, in really simple models, it's bigger than 1. I mean, the right way to say it is it should be big. It might be, 1.5, 1.75, and I estimated it would be something like 1.7 or something like that in the data. So now I want to talk about why is this, what's good about it, and in kind of simple terms. And to explain that, I want to say that in models where this is used a lot, the new Keynesian model, those models have have something called a unique sort of a steady state equilibrium, and that phi pi makes that, kind of selects that equilibrium, that stabilizes the economy. And what I want to do was show you that why it is that phi pi relative to 1 in this particular case is so very, very important. Why does it stabilize the economy? And I really should be wearing now an outfit like a raisin. Then I think I would look more like John, because I'm going to put up a graph here. Apologies to, I think I'll have to apologize to every single person here. Some of you who know about this stuff think this is stupid, and then those of you who don't know about it maybe, or forgotten about it from your undergraduate work. But here I want to just show very quickly why it is that the Taylor principle is so very important. So I'm saying let's suppose that the monetary authorities but responding to expected inflation. And the Taylor rule is that thing up there. Now, the Taylor rule involves variables that the central bank actually doesn't control. So what the central bank does is it enters into the financial markets and does some kind of stuff. And that stuff is summarized by that thing called the LM curve. Now, let's suppose that the economy was kind of trying to be unstable. So all of a sudden, people think there's going to be inflation. They see a movie about Argentina. Oh, my God, that could happen here. So they expect higher inflation. That's the nominal interest rate on the vertical axis. Higher inflation means the real interest rate is lower. So with higher expected inflation, the intersection, that curve at that old interest rate would imply a huge demand for goods. The IS curve shifts up vertically by the amount of the increase in that thing. What John Taylor's suggestion is that they should enter the financial markets, and that's all stuff going on in the background. One of the geniuses of this rule is you don't actually have to talk about financial markets. There are some assumptions there, but they seem, in the light of hindsight, to be wise ones. What you have to do is shift that LM curve to the left by enough so that the interest rate rises by more than the rise in inflation. And then notice that what happens then is that the two new lines, they intersect at a higher level, at a lower level of output, because expected inflation went up, but the interest rate went up by less, so the real interest rate is low. And, the nominal interest rate goes up by more than the inflation, so the real interest rate's high, demand is low, output falls, and guess what happens to inflation? It goes down. So the key thing about this monetary policy is that if people expect just randomly, for no good reason, that there's going to be more inflation, the central bank actually engineers a situation where there's less inflation. It defeats their belief. In a learning model, when there's learning, what happens is that this happens, people respond to random things and change their expected inflation, and then they always see the opposite when they expect more inflation, so they don't do this random stuff anymore. It stabilizes the economy. You can see that the economy is unstable because it went from Y1 to Y2. Okay, so I'm told I have to stop, so I'm going to just go to the conclusion here. So that's the normative argument. So I'm way behind here. I want to argue that that graph that I put up has a huge amount of wisdom in it. That if you build dynamic models with what's called learning, what ends up happening is you end up converging to the rational expectations equilibrium, thus justifying the use of that idea in the first place. We also show that there are many rational expectations equilibria. This policy rule selects the nice one. Anyway, so this is all self-referential, so we stop that. And then there's the road ahead. I just want to say one thing about the road ahead is that, as was shown by Monika, and it's been discussed and probably will be discussed a lot more, the Fed deviated from the Taylor rule in 2021, January, for about a year. And this has created some real problems. There is a sense now that inflation has become de-anchored, which I think is what John would have suggested. And any event, it's a tribute to John, actually. I think that he gives an analysis of this that he wrote down 20 years before it actually happened. Anyway, I'm grateful to be included in this celebration of John's work.
And last but not least, we have John Cochrane.
Thanks. This is great fun. I'm reminded, I owe a lot to John Taylor, but I also owe a lot to Larry Christiano. In the 1990s, there was a weekly food fight on monetary policy down at the Chicago Fed with him and Larry. And I miss it, Larry. Him and Marty Eichenbaum. So I want to talk about the Taylor rule. This is our assigned topic. This is a case of influence, not just contribution. We've talked about John's contribution, but the people took the Taylor rule and ran with it. And I'll show you a little bit of where we went with it. It is, as we said, it inherits, in some sense, the mantle of other rules, but it's better and more realistic. Yet, beyond that contribution, here's where we took it in monetary theory. So let's go back to Milton Friedman, 1968. And Friedman had a very, in page 2 of his speech, he told us that there's a problem with interest rates. If you have an interest rate target, inflation will be unstable. And I drew a little diagram of what unstable means, and my little seal with the ball on its nose that tells you what unstable means. If you target an interest rate, inflation might pick up, then the real interest rate is low, that pushes aggregate demand or money printing in his case, and off it goes. Said Friedman, do not target interest rates, set the money supply. Now, there's a big problem with this. Our central banks set interest rates. And it's kind of interesting that in academia even, we still have models with money supply determining inflation into the 2000s. We need a theory of inflation under interest rate targets. It's not enough to say you need to set the money supply, because they don't. I mean, that might be nice about Mars or about past history, but we need one. So here's where John comes in. I'm sorry, not only do they not set the money supply, there's no reserve requirements. Interest rate on reserves is the same as other things. We're just awash in liquidity. So raising the rate more than 1 for 1 in this kind of model stabilizes inflation. Now, this seems obvious once you look at it, but if inflation is unstable, like the seal, if the seal moves his nose more than 1 for 1 following inflation, then inflation becomes stable, even though the central bank is targeting interest rates. So yes, we can study central banks that target interest rates and have no money supply control whatsoever. And completing a theory of inflation under interest rate targets it took a long time, but that was the first step to let us do it. Now, new Keynesian models came along and upended how we thought the economy works. And one way of saying, for those of you not in this game, new Keynesian models said we have to follow the Bob Lucas rules of economic models. None of this ad hoc equation-y stuff. People are rational, markets clear, specify your policy invariant things, and that's the achievement of new Keynesian economics. In new Keynesian models, there's a completely different problem. Again, the doctrine was you can't have interest rate targets. You have to control the money supply, but for a different reason. And the reason wasn't instability. I'm going to complain about Larry's use of those words. The reason here was indeterminacy. In the new Keynesian model, as I've graphed there, inflation is stable. If the Fed runs an interest rate target, inflation will eventually come back to where the interest rate is. Sort of Professor Calculus's little pendulum is my illustration of what I mean by stability there. Great, go to sleep. Aha, there's a problem. There are multiple equilibria, and sunspots could drive us from one equilibrium to another, and the model isn't complete. We don't know which equilibrium will come out. Said Sergeant Wallace, target the money supply. But our central banks don't target the money supply. We need a theory that applies to this planet, what to do. Here, the Taylor principle has a completely different effect. The vision is, as I show you in the green lines, the central bank, by following this principle, by raising more than 1 for 1, what it does is it takes an economy that is already stable and makes it unstable. Now, why would anyone do anything as nutty like that? Well, it makes it unstable, but for all but one value of inflation. And by that, it's sort of like Dr. Strangelove down on the bottom here. There's multiple equilibria. If you guys go to any equilibrium other than the one I like, I blow up the world with hyperinflation. So you jump to the equilibrium I like. It gives you determinacy out of an indeterminate model. The equation is the simplest one right there. I equals phi pi. Add it to I equals et pi t plus 1. Therefore, et pi t plus 1 is phi pi t. By setting phi greater than 1, you induce instability for all but pi equals 0, and then we jump to the equilibrium you like. So completely different mechanism, but again, that solves the outstanding problem. Now, of course, I'm Mr. Fiscal Theory, but the Taylor rule works here too. In fiscal theory, the government valuation equation, not budget constraint, that picks one of the many stable equilibria. Only one of those equilibria is the fiscal surplus sufficient to pay the interest costs on the debt. And that is what selects equilibria instead of learning rules, instead of the Fed threats and so forth. So we have a model where inflation is stable, determinate, and long-run neutral under an interest rate target. Hooray! We've finally gotten to what MV equals PY had, except with interest rate targets. But you'd think, well, central banks are gone. No, they're not gone. Central banks are still important, and I illustrate that in the bottom. In the bottom left is a fiscal theory. What happens in 2021? We dump $5 trillion of money on people with no plan to pay it back, and the Fed does nothing. You get a bout of inflation. What happens if the Fed raises interest rates and no change in fiscal policy? It lowers inflation in the short run, but raises it in the long run. But nonetheless, you get a response that you would think would be pretty normal. Raising interest rates can lower inflation. Add those two together, it is a great and good thing for the Fed to meet the fiscal policy shock by raising the interest rate. And in fact, raising the interest rate automatically when inflation goes up does the trick. What it gives you is there's got to be the inflation. We have to inflate away those bonds as Bob Barrow showed us. But you can inflate them away slowly rather than quickly, and that minimizes the output effects. So the Taylor rule, or something very close to it, is really great in the fiscal theory model too. So in monetary theory, the Taylor rule is always the answer. It's just the questions that keep changing. That's usually an insult. Tariffs are always the answer. It's just the questions that keep changing. But in this case, it's praise. That's what gives you the robustness of the Taylor rule. You saw how vastly different those models are. Stability, indeterminacy, and optimal smoothing are three totally fundamentally different things, but the Taylor rule works great. And John's done a lot of this work too. Every individual model has an optimal policy rule that's a teeny bit better than the Taylor rule, but they'll blow up in the other models. The Taylor rule does great in lots of models. But there is trouble in paradise. So in the last 30 years, here I showed you I rewrote the Taylor rule in the Bob King rule, which I absolutely love. Take the shock and spread it out into an interest rate target and an inflation target, and you can write the determinacy giving Taylor rule in that form. And here you can see very quickly that what determinacy is doing. Phi greater than 1 means only pi equals pi star is the right equilibrium. It's an equilibrium selection policy. But you can see the problem too. If pi equals pi star, you can't see that equilibrium selection threat in the actual data where pi equals pi star. So that's the problem. Rich Clarida did some of the fantastic work, as well as Bob, as well as John, showing how the Fed followed phi greater than 1 in the 1980s, but that doesn't measure the phi of this model. It measures the phi of the other model, but not the phi of this model. And ask yourself, really? Do central banks do equilibrium selection by threatening hyperinflation? As we have some central bankers here, is that your central job? Or is your central job, as described in the old model, raise interest rates to push inflation back down in the future? Were the 1970s the failure really indeterminacy, multiple equilibrium, sunspots, not policy mistakes? Did Volcker really succeed by quashing multiple equilibrium volatility? And if so, why didn't we see that again when the zero bound stopped the Taylor rule from operating for 10 years here and 30 years in Japan? Furthermore, in the new Keynesian model, I hate to break it to you, interest rates on their own raise inflation. The I equals E pi continues to work even with sticky prices. I'll be very quick. The equilibrium selection is doing all the work there. So the equations of the new Keynesian model look nothing like the way people think it works. Now, maybe the equations are right and maybe people are right. We don't know. And that, I think, is an enormous challenge right now. The equations of this model are not working the way everyone thinks they work. We either need a new model or we need to recognize our view of reality. So my last comment, I promise this is the last slide. Rules rule. Some good things about Taylor rule. A big change in how we do stuff. We usually think of responses to shocks as measuring monetary policy as in VARs. What Rich's regressions and John's regressions teach you is that that's just the wrong question. A shock against a stable rule is not what monetary policy is all about. Monetary policy is all about getting a better rule. And despite my complaints about new Keynesian models and off equilibrium and stuff, What you guys showed is let's measure better rules being followed, and that's the key of monetary policy. Another challenge, how do we really measure the effects of better rules and not with something as mechanical as a VAR? Still hasn't been done. And the last big comment, Bob Lucas and John Taylor emphasized we have people in the economy who are forward-looking, who react to what you're doing. If you hit them over the head with a 2x4, you might get them once, but they'll duck next time around. So you have to think about policy with people who are anticipating what you do. You must think in terms of rules. You can't just think in terms of actions and reactions, because next time they'll duck and it won't work. And that is also a deeply important effect of John's work. Thank you.
Thank you. John's talk reminded me of the time that I had sent him a paper to ask for comments on and had a statement in the paper that the Taylor principle was necessary and sufficient in old Keynesian models, but sufficient but not necessary in new Keynesian models. And John wrote back saying, you're absolutely correct, but you should never put that in print because nobody would ever understand it. Luckily, the referees didn't notice. So we have a few minutes for questions, and then I'll take them as a group and then give the four panelists a minute each to respond. So. Am I missing? Oh, go ahead, Andy. Oh, and just say your name for the transcript.
Yes, hi, I'm Andy Levin. Really great panel, thanks to all of you. So a question for Monika and Rich. So Monika, you were talking about financial institutions and how they need to think about systematic policy. What do they do when the Fed says, well, we're just taking a meeting by meeting approach? And then my question for Rich is, when we think back about Silicon Valley Bank and the extent to which they apparently didn't realize that the Fed might need to raise rates, and so they were making decisions about their portfolio that turned out to have a lot of interest rate risk. But you were describing about alternative scenarios, and I'm imagining here not only the FOMC using that, but also then bringing it into the stress tests, you know, for at least some financial institutions to sort of make sure the financial institutions are aware that, oh, you know, we hope the rates will be staying low, but there is a scenario where we need to raise them. And maybe, Monika, if you want to comment on that too, that'd be great.
Other questions? Harold.
Yeah, from a Taylor rule perspective, the last 3 years are puzzling to me. Inflation went way up and nominal interest rates didn't go up quite as much. If you do back of the envelope calculation, then maybe nominal interest rates should have gone up to 12%, and that should have ultimately lowered inflation to where we are now. Certainly we didn't do anything close to that. So I'm curious, and maybe that drives differences out between the panelists. What do you think made inflation come back? Was it the fiscal policy that got it back? Was it the fact that inflation is stable regardless of what monetary policy does? Was it some implicit threat that interest rates would rise down the road if inflation wasn't willing to come back? Or was it that inflation expectations are simply anchored and monetary policy nowadays has little to do with that?
Anyone else? Wait, this here.
Okay, thanks. Actually, this is related to Harold's question. So I'm confused about the optimal Taylor rule in today's environment. So, you know, the result that you should react more than 1-for-1 to inflation, it was optimal in the world in which the rule was developed, when we seem to have backward-looking expectations and a Phillips curve with a coefficient of close to 1 on lagged inflation. You know, now we live in a world of anchored expectations. So I guess my question is, how much does that change the Taylor principle or the Taylor rule? I mean, my intuition is that If expectations stay anchored, you don't necessarily have to act more than 1-for-1 for every short-run movement in inflation. And maybe that's why the Fed, didn't think it was essential to raise interest rates by as much as inflation went up in the short run after the pandemic. But I'm actually confused about what the panelists or what the inventor of the Taylor rule would say about its relevance with anchored expectations, or how it should be modified.
Any more? Let's take one more.
Thank you. Krishna Guha with Evercore. As I think at least one of the panelists already mentioned, in practice, the Taylor rules that are used in monetary policy setting almost always have quite high inertial coefficients, and yet this was never part of the theoretical work. I'd be interested in what the panelists feel about the merits and demerits of the practice of inertia in central banking. Thank you.
Okay, let's now go down the row, and we'll start with Vetch.
All right, I drew the short straw. I got the SVB question. Let me clarify. I was well back in Westport, Connecticut, and Columbia during SVP, so I have no firsthand thinking on that. I mean, in terms of what or was not in the stress test. Maybe I'll take another couple of these questions and building on something Monika said in her very incredible work. One thing I've done informally for at least 20 years is in a factor model of the yield curve. One of the factors is the Taylor rule residual. What is the deviation from the Taylor rule? And that actually turns out to be a very important macro factor. So I think that's the other way of the applicability. It's not only when central banks follow Taylor rules, but when they deviate, that's also relevant to market. That's also relevant to market pricing. Maybe to Larry Ball's question, at least during my time, 2018 to early 2022, my thinking is it would not make sense to take anchored inflation expectations for granted. I think it helped that we had 25 years of low inflation, and that probably was quite useful in this cycle as we spent several years, now going on 5 years above the 2% target. But I think at least when I was in the job, I did not take it for granted that if the Fed kept rates at zero for 11 years, that they would stay anchored. So I think that's probably part of the thinking.
Okay, Monika?
I agree. I think right now we see some de-anchoring of inflation expectations. Inflation expectations are rising, and that together with high risk premia seems to suggest to me that, of course, there's a lot of other things going on at the moment, but at least the experience of deviating and not reacting to high inflation has created some uncertainty among households, but also financial economists of what's going on and what the Fed is going to do. And the meeting by meeting decisions, I don't think is helping with that. Having a stable rule in place and deviating, as John was saying earlier, only when there's something spectacular that gives a reason for deviating, I think makes much more sense, because you want to have expectations in place that incorporate a rule-based decision making.
John?
Larry and I
doesn't matter.
we were commiserating about how many questions can we remember at once. So Harold, what happened? There's graphs on the slides, which is my answer to what happened, and it's just perfect. Where did inflation come from? You have a one-time fiscal blowout. That's a one-time price level increase, which goes away on its own, even if the Fed did nothing. The Fed raised rates a little bit, and that put that monetary mechanism in, brought them back a little faster. Done as far as explanation what happened. So the next one was anchoring and inertial rules, which are kind of related. The Fed keeps saying this, anchored. Anchored by what?
Yeah.
What are we going to do if they go on? We're just going to give more speeches about anchoring? It has to be anchored by an expectation that if things get bad, the Fed will do something. And even we'll repeat 1980-82 if we have to. That's kind of the heart of the Taylor rule. Now you can't make that expectation out there and never actually move things. So I think part of what you're doing by responding to inflation now is getting people to understand we'll repeat 1980, 82, even if we never will say that in public if things get bad. And similarly, that's in the theory that we're all, in the equations here, it doesn't really matter how slowly you raise it, so long as eventually you raise more than 1 for 1. So as far as either what I call stabilizing or equilibrium selection, both of those work with very large degrees of persistence. And given the noise in the data, some amount of persistence, I hope this isn't heresy, but some amount of persistence seems like to actually make some sense.
Larry.
First of all, John was completely correct in one thing he said, which is that
Not the rest.
not the rest, but the questions got kind of muddled in my mind now. So maybe I'll just say a couple of things. One is that through the eyes, or through what I think are the eyes of John Taylor, what happened in this period from Biden's inauguration speech when inflation took off to a year later when the Fed started raising rates, that was again, doing this through the eyes of John, and he's here, unfortunately, so he might disagree with me, but what I see is that from Biden's speech on, there was a sequence of positive monetary shocks coming from the Fed, that people had kind of expected them to follow the Taylor rule, and they didn't. They had a story about it. We can set that aside for a second, so you had a sequence of positive monetary shocks, and then eventually the sequence stopped. What that explains, I think, and it has nothing to do with the fiscal stuff, what that explains in my mind is simply why the economy was so powerful during the Biden administration. The Democrats weren't good at explaining this, but the economy was very strong, and I think that's because of that, the sequence of positive monetary shocks, which then went away. One other thought I wanted to just say is a little bit in response to John, because he and I also had many I had wonderful recollections of all of it. We had friendly food fight. John is the one person you can have a bitter fight with, but it's fun. So it's an extraordinary personality. I actually think it's like John Taylor a little bit, that John can be tough, but there's always a friendliness in the background. Anyway,
Larry.
this idea that monetary policy stabilizes in the Taylor rule by threatening to blow up things, I think is incorrect. This idea, in order to understand this idea, or to respond to it, you have to go back and ask, why would a rational expectations equilibrium even happen? And I think the best idea for that is Bob Lucas's idea, which is that it's interesting, rational expectations, if it's a place where you go where people like us make mistakes and slowly catch on. My example was designed to show how the Taylor rule works there. That it works by, it gets expectations anchored by knocking them over the head a little bit when they're going in the wrong direction. Eventually, you stop having them go in the expectation going into in the wrong direction.
Larry.
Now, okay, this one last sentence, because it has to do with stability. The learning equilibrium is a stable process. It's iterating the other way you do. You iterate one direction in the forward direction, which is wrong and gives you explosion. Learning iterates in the other direction.
I think it's time to bring this. Can we?
2 seconds, which is, this illustrates why macro is so fun. That we have two very simple equations, and we can fight for 20, for 30 years about the interpretation of these equations, and we will keep at it.
And thank you very much.
So
let me just thank the members of the panel, and especially John Taylor, for continuing to be an inspiration to us all. Thank you.